Well, hello to all of my methodical researchers out there. In our last video, we went over some of the characteristics and attributes of ALRs, and we talked about when and why you might use them in your research. Today, we are going to discuss how you would actually go about finding ALRs. And then we're going to run through an example or two to show how that finding process might actually work and how you would use ALRs once you find them. Now, my constant refrain throughout this course is to find sources to use sources. And that really is the path of least resistance here. It just makes things so much easier. Some of the other secondary sources that you find, particularly your legal encyclopedias, your AMJUR, your Georgia jurisprudence, but some others as well, will always include links to relevant ALR annotations. You're going to find these at the beginning of the different sections, and you'll also find these in the separate section that begins each chapter that's titled Research References. Now, just because it is in AMJUR, and it seems at least somewhat related to your research, does not necessarily mean that it is the absolute best fit for your research. So you're also going to want to look in the annotation itself. You're going to want to go to its research references, which is going to give you just all of the related annotations. The titles of these annotations are usually going to be very descriptive. So you should be able to just quickly browse through them to find the most relevant ALRs for your legal research. And as I emphasized in my last video, it is really important that you find the annotation that's the best fit for your research, because ultimately in the long run, that is going to save you a lot of time and is going to be much more useful for you. Now, in addition to that, if you're on Westlaw, which you probably should be if you're using ALRs, you can use the ALR index, which can help you find annotations that might share concepts or vocabulary that might be otherwise difficult to find. However, note that the ALR index, it doesn't have the most user-friendly design. You do need to put a little bit of effort into using the ALR index efficiently, but it is a powerful tool that you should know about. Similarly, Westlaw also has the ALR Digest, which is a really powerful tool. It tries to apply the same concept of topical organization that you see in your headnotes and the key number system to the body of ALR annotations. And it is, like I said, a very powerful tool, but it's also dense, it's also difficult to use, so you're going to want to put the time into mastering ALRs themselves before you really try to incorporate it into your research approach. Now finally, and most intuitively, you can simply search the ALR database to find annotations. And here, those descriptive titles of ALR annotations can really help you to get more focused results if you simply search the title field. And I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. All right, what time is it? It's everyone's favorite time. It's example time. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, your secondary sources, your legal encyclopedias in particular, are often just the path of least resistance for finding relevant ALR annotations. I've went ahead and pulled up our familiar friend, our Georgia jurisprudence entry for the elements of the tort of battery. And we can see as we scroll down at the very beginning here that it has an ALR library. And this is going to be the place that in the encyclopedia entry, you will find your reference to a relevant ALR annotation. Here, the annotation concerns secondhand smoke as battery, which, as you know, it closely relates to the fact pattern that we've used for this battery hypothetical throughout the course. So let's pull that up. We'll open link in new tab magic. Now, just the title there, that gives you a pretty good idea of just the type of specificity that ALRs bring to the table. And I think you can already probably see why something that specific, something that related to a single issue or very specific factual scenario could just be super helpful for your research. Now, whenever you find a new ALR, you're going to want to consult this very first introductory section. And it's not this introductory section, but the introduction scope here. And this introduction scope section, the scope section, will tell you exactly what the annotation covers and exactly what it does not cover. And it will also often refer you to other annotations that may cover some of those things that this particular annotation does not cover. This is especially important, as I've tried to emphasize, because ALRs are going to be difficult and time-consuming for you to navigate. So you don't want to waste time if there's another annotation out there that would be a better fit for you. Here in our scope section, we learn that, for example, this does not cover any statutes that might specifically give people a remedy for being harmed by secondhand smoke. Now, if there isn't another annotation that covers that, it doesn't seem like that's included in the ALR library. It's just not available. But if there were another annotation that did cover these statutes, we would see a link to it here in the footnotes for this introductory scope section. And that's the reason you're going to want to make sure to check it closely. Now next, and for similar reasons, you're also going to want to check your research references. You can always find that towards the bottom. This is going to give you additional related annotations. And like we did with the scope section, we are basically just trying to make sure that that we're at the best annotation. There's not another annotation out there that would make more sense for us to use. So we can see here that our research references really give us quite a variety of related annotations that might just be very difficult for us to track down otherwise. We've got annotations covering permissible regulations of e-cigarettes. We've got annotations on an employer's liability for failing to provide a smoke-free work environment, the tort of intentional infliction of emotional distress for toxic exposure. Lots of stuff that, is at least conceptually kind of tied to some of the ideas involved with the secondary smoke is battery annotation that we're looking at. And we just really want to know whether, maybe one of these would be a better fit for our situation. And in addition, just scrolling over these might actually make us think of additional related legal issues that we might want to research as well. Now, in addition, our research references are also usually going to give us a lot of other helpful secondary sources. And some of these we've probably already found at this point in our research, like our legal encyclopedia entries, and maybe some of our treatises and practice aids here. But we've also got some other ones. We've got some forms that might be helpful. We've got the restatement, some law review articles. This can be a great way to find like more advanced and sophisticated sources that address your topic, and it'll also help you kind of ohm in on the part of that source that would be the most relevant for you. So because ALRs are so dense, when you're trying to navigate what it contains, the indents is an especially useful tool. And you can find the indents, and this is somewhat counterintuitive because usually we see an indents at the end of a particular source, but here our indents is actually pretty much right at the beginning after our outline. So, for example of how you might use this annotation, we know that in our original factual scenario that we talked about, weeks ago in this course, the defendant blew smoke in our client's face. So we might use the index just to see, is that mentioned anywhere in here? And here we see it, blowing smoke into face. See just how specific this index can be, how it can help us to locate, really particular, aspects of these cases that might match our scenario. So we see that entry in the index for blowing smoke into face. And when we click on that, it's going to take us to the section of the ALR where that particular aspect of a factual scenario is mentioned. And we see here that it looks like it is included in this description of this Lightman versus WLW Jacor communications case, some type of Ohio case it looks like. So this section is going to give you cases where a court held that a cause of action for battery, a claim for battery based on secondhand smoke, was held to be supportable. It was a viable claim, in other words. And it looks like in this particular case, because, or at least in part, because of the fact that the defendant blew smoke in the plaintiff's face, that contributed to it being a viable battery claim. And that kind of gives you a basic idea also of just how these annotations are structured. And the article outline itself can really help to shed some light on this. And one reason I like this annotation in particular, just for illustrative purposes, is because it's relatively simple. We've only got cause of action held supportable versus cause of action held not supportable. So we get cases that go one way, and then we get cases that go the other way. And that's often going to be very helpful for us to just get an idea of, how these cases turn out and why they turn out that way, because it's so factually intensive in its analysis and descriptions. So I like this particular annotation for illustrative purposes because it's so simple and straightforward. We've only got one issue, which is the viability of our overall claim of a battery, based on secondary smoke. And we've got cases where the claim was viable or it was held supportable. And then we've got cases where it was held not to be viable or supportable. That's all we've got here. But this is really kind of an outlier in terms of the complexity that you're going to encounter in an annotation. So more often it's going to be something a little closer to what we see in this annotation, which is, what constitutes a substantial limitation on the major life activity of learning for the purposes of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So here, we can just see that it's just much more dense with information. And a lot of the information in the subdivisions are really, based on different, very specific factual aspects that are relevant in the context of this particular law. And you can just see just the wide variety of very specific factual issues that can come up here. And within that framework, the basic structure, though, is the same. So here we can see that, we have cases where, based on, brain injury or trauma, they did establish a substantial limitation. And then we've got the same factual scenario, but the substantial limitation was not established. And so on for just all of these different other conditions. And I think it's easy to recognize, just how useful this would be if one of these particular conditions was present in your factual scenario. It would be such a great tool for finding cases. But let's go back to our secondary smoke as battery annotation. You also need to know how to use the tools in the ALR to narrow by jurisdiction. This isn't going to be exactly the same as the jurisdiction filter works for most other sources. When we click on Georgia and we apply our jurisdiction, it's essentially going to highlight, all of the sections and cases and other sources that are, Georgia related, that occur in the jurisdiction of Georgia. And then you can use the previous and next to navigate among those. So it gives us not only like the occurrence in the outline where we run into Georgia within the specific sections of that outline that provides sort of our table of contents for the ALR, but it also gives us the Georgia case in our table of cases. And finally, we can see where it is mentioned, in our discussion. And it looks like in this particular Georgia case that we've looked at before, the Henley v. Richardson, they actually found that the claim of battery was not viable. So that's how you're going to quickly locate cases in your jurisdiction. But of course, when you've got so many more cases like you do with our ADA ALR, you're just going to be way more cases for you to, navigate through. But the basic way that you're doing it, is not that different. This is just running through using these previous to next buttons to make sure that we've looked at all of the cases that are in our jurisdiction. So yeah, the ALR that we've looked at the most, our secondhand smoke is battery ALR. It's really, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. But what you're going to run into more often is going to be a lot more complex than what you see here. But, the same concepts basically apply. You're going to usually try to use a secondary source to find an annotation, and then you're going to want to check your scope note and your research references just to ensure that you found the best fit for your research. So for this ADA annotation, our scope note is right here, and we would want to read that. And we can see here that our scope section actually does give us a footnote that directs us to some other annotations that discuss some related issues that are not discussed in this particular annotation. So, if we knew that we were actually more interested in, reasonable accommodations under the ADA, then we would want to go to this annotation and not waste any more time on this substantial limitation of the major life activity of learning annotation that we're looking at now. And, you're essentially going to try to do this to make sure that, this is the best fit for the issue that you're researching. And similarly, you're going to find your research references. I'm going to go ahead and undo that jurisdiction locator. Similarly, you're going to find your research references, basically in the same place. It's just easier to use that table of contents to navigate to things. But similarly, it gives us just a variety of different secondary sources, many of which could be very helpful, as well as some primary sources. If we hadn't found those yet, that could be useful. And, really the gold mine here is just all of the different annotations, on the ADA, on related legal issues. This could just be very helpful to us. And, we'd want to browse over this to make sure that maybe one of these aren't maybe a better fit for what we're actually researching now. So one other thing that I did want to quickly show you is how to search for ALR annotations by title, which can help you more easily find, the most relevant annotation for your needs. And also, more generally, the skill involved here, called field searching, can really be quite helpful in a variety of contexts. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to navigate to the ALR database within Westlaw. So in order to do that, we're just going to click on secondary sources. And wow, American Law Reports is the very first source that we see under by type. We'll click on that. So when we have navigated to a particular database or a particular source within Westlaw or Lexis, we're going to notice a few things about the interface that we get. The first thing is that on the sidebar here, under Tools and Resources, you're going to see some very useful finding tools and some related sources. So the ALR Digest and the ALR Index are just going to be located right here on this sidebar if you want to explore using those. Like I said, those are kind of challenging to use in some ways, so I would encourage you to chiefly rely upon your secondary sources to find the best ALR annotations for your needs. But you can supplement that with this idea of searching the database of ALRs or running field searches, as I'm just about to show you. So the other thing you're going to notice about the interface that you get is that once you've navigated to our particular database, when you click on your advanced search over here, it is now going to have a set of document fields that you can use to search the specific fields of that type of source. So this can be useful in context other than American Law Reports, because if you're searching a database of cases, it will allow you to, for example, just search the headnotes, just search the text of the opinion, to just search, perhaps the caption if you're just searching for a particular party, or, to even just search the judge if you really just want to find cases that, where a particular judge has written the opinion. Within the context of ALRs, I think usually, the most helpful way to implement this sort of field searching technique is to use field searching to search our titles. And this helps us avoid getting a bunch of mostly irrelevant kind of garbage in our results. So let's take the Americans with Disabilities Act ALRs that we were looking at just a moment ago. We can search for just the annotations that have Americans with Disabilities Act. We'll put that in quotations, so it only includes that phrase, that exact phrase. And let's say we want to focus on annotations that discuss, whether something is a major life activity under that act. Something is only a disability if it substantially limits a major life activity. And we want only annotations that discuss that major life activity aspect of the ADA. And if we do that, we know that all of the results that we find are going to specifically have, major life activity and Americans with Disabilities Act within their title. And in the particular case of ALRs, we know that because their titles tend to very accurately describe what they contain, that this is going to be a good way of refining our search in a way that could be potentially useful for us if this was the issue that we were researching. So yeah, that is your introduction to finding and using American Law Reports. Like I tried to emphasize, often your secondary source that you use for preliminary analysis, particularly if it's a legal encyclopedia, is really going to be sort of your go-to method for finding relevant ALR annotations. And you can follow that up by running searches of the ALR database, and by using the annotation that you find to locate other annotations via that scope section at the beginning of the annotation or using the research references that you find closer to the end. Other aspects of an ALR annotation that you need to be familiar with in order to use it effectively are the sidebar locate authority by jurisdiction filtering mechanism that you have, as well as the index, which tends to be especially useful in this context since the analysis presented in the annotations is going to be so factually intensive, and that can help you to locate factual scenarios within the cases collected that are close to your own fact pattern. Okay, that's all I have for now. Until next time.